Right now, in 2025, the United States dollar controls 58% of global currency reserves. Every barrel of oil sold, every international debt instrument issued, every central bank around the world holds dollars as their primary reserve. But here's what most Americans don't realize. In 1945, the British pound controlled 60% of global reserves. Britain had just won World War II. They defeated Hitler. They still commanded the Royal Navy, the most powerful military force on Earth. The pound was backed by an empire spanning 1/4 of the globe. If you had told a British banker in 1945 that in just 11 years their currency would become worthless on the global stage, he would have called you insane. The system was too big to fail. But it did fail, in exactly 11 years. From 1945 to 1956, Britain went from controlling global finance to begging the International Monetary Fund for emergency loans. And the mechanism that destroyed the British pound is not just similar to what's happening to the US dollar right now. It's identical. The same pattern, the same timeline, the same fatal mistakes. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented economic history. And we are not at the beginning of this cycle. We are 16 years in. We are past the breaking point. Today, I'm going to show you why 2027 isn't just another year. It's the mathematical endpoint of a reserve currency collapse that has already entered its terminal phase. The pattern is undeniable. Same playbook, different century. The receipts are public record. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand why 2027 matters, we need to understand how reserve currencies actually work and why they collapse. Let's start with Britain, because their story is our story, told with mathematical precision across the decades. In 1821, Britain officially adopted the gold standard. 1 British pound equaled 113 grains of pure gold. This wasn't a promise. This was a contract. If you held a pound note, you could walk into the Bank of England and exchange it for actual gold, no questions asked. This created something extraordinary: trust. Merchants in New York, Shanghai, and Buenos Aires all wanted to be paid in British pounds because pounds were as good as gold. Better than gold, actually, because pounds could be transmitted by telegraph, while gold had to be physically shipped. By 1900, 60% of global trade was denominated in pounds. When a Japanese company bought American wheat, they settled the transaction in pounds. When a German bank loaned money to a Brazilian railroad, the loan was denominated in pounds. The pound became the global unit of account. This gave Britain an extraordinary privilege. Because everyone needed pounds, Britain could borrow at incredibly low interest rates. The British government issued debt, and the whole world bought it, because holding British government bonds was considered as safe as holding gold. This allowed Britain to run permanent trade deficits. Britain could import more than it exported, because the world was willing to hold pounds forever. You export inflation and import prosperity. This is the reserve currency privilege. Britain used this privilege to build the greatest empire in history. 800 million people lived under British rule. The Royal Navy controlled every major shipping lane. British banks financed railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in India. The sun never set on the British Empire because British money never stopped flowing. But then came World War I. From 1914 to 1918, Britain spent 886,000 soldiers and $9.6 billion, which in today's money is over $1 trillion. Britain's national debt went from 30% of GDP to 140% of GDP. To fund this war, Britain did something it had never done before. It suspended the gold standard. In 1914, the Bank of England announced that pounds would no longer be convertible to gold for the duration of the emergency. This was supposed to be temporary. Here's the thing about emergencies: they never end. The war ended in 1918, but Britain did not immediately return to the gold standard because the debt was too large. If Britain allowed pounds to be freely converted to gold at the old rate, every creditor would immediately demand gold, and the Bank of England's reserves would be gone in weeks. So Britain kept the suspension. The pound became a fiat currency for the first time in 100 years. Its value was now based not on gold, but on trust in the British government. And that trust was beginning to crack. By 1925, Britain tried to restore the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This was a disaster. The pound was now overvalued. British exports became expensive. The British economy went into recession while America boomed. And critically, other nations began to question whether Britain actually had enough gold to back all the pounds circulating globally. Then came World War II. From 1939 to 1945, Britain fought for survival. The cost was another $28 billion in today's money. National debt reached 250% of GDP. Britain had gone from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. Britain owed massive debts to the United States, to Canada, to India, to every colony that had supplied material during the war. The Bank of England's gold reserves were depleted. By 1945, Britain was technically bankrupt. But here's the critical point that most people miss. In 1945, Britain still had the reserve currency. Global trade was still denominated in pounds. Everyone still needed pounds. And this is where the pattern becomes crystal clear. Having the reserve currency allowed Britain to keep borrowing even though it was bankrupt. Because the world needed pounds for trade, countries were forced to continue lending to Britain, even though Britain could never realistically pay back. Britain was able to sustain the illusion of financial strength for 11 more years purely because of reserve currency inertia. Everyone was trapped in the pound system. There was no alternative yet. But Britain made a fatal mistake during these 11 years. The same mistake Rome made when they debased the denarius. The same mistake the Weimar Republic made. The same mistake America is making right now. Faced with enormous debt and unable to cut spending or raise taxes enough to balance the budget, Britain started printing money. The Bank of England expanded the money supply dramatically. From 1945 to 1956, Britain's money supply tripled. But Britain's production of goods did not triple. The result was inflation. The pound was losing purchasing power. Foreign governments holding pounds as reserves began to notice. They began to ask questions. If we are holding pounds that are losing value every year, why are we holding pounds? Britain had to make a choice. Britain could either defend the pound by raising interest rates and cutting spending, which would cause a depression, or Britain could keep printing and hope the world did not notice. Britain chose to keep printing. This is the easy path, the fatal path. Then came 1956. The Suez Crisis. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France, trying to reassert their imperial power, invaded Egypt to take the canal back. The United States, which was now the real global superpower, told Britain to stand down. Britain refused. So America did something that had never been done before. America attacked the pound. Let me show you exactly how this worked. The US Treasury began selling pounds and buying dollars on foreign exchange markets. Within days, the pound crashed. Britain was hemorrhaging gold reserves, trying to defend the pound's value. Within a week, Britain had lost 15% of its entire gold reserves. The Bank of England was on the verge of running out of gold completely. Britain was forced to go to the International Monetary Fund and beg for a loan. The IMF agreed, but only on one condition. Britain had to withdraw from Egypt immediately. Britain complied. The empire was over. But more importantly, the reserve currency was over. The breaking point was 1956, exactly 11 years after the war ended. Now let's hold up that mirror. Let's look at the United States of America and see the exact same pattern unfolding with mathematical precision. Just like Britain, America emerged from World War II as the dominant power. Just like Britain after World War I, America created a new monetary system at a conference in Bretton Woods in 1944. The US dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. This created the same extraordinary privilege that Britain had enjoyed. Because everyone needed dollars, America could borrow at low interest rates. America could run trade deficits. America could print money, and the world would accept it because dollars were needed for international trade. The world became trapped in the dollar system, just as they had been trapped in the pound system before. And just like Britain, America began to abuse this privilege. In the 1960s, America fought the Vietnam War while simultaneously launching the Great Society welfare programs. This required enormous spending. The federal budget deficit exploded. Gold began draining out of the US Treasury as foreign nations exchanged dollars for gold, just like creditors had demanded gold from Britain in the 1920s. By 1971, just like Britain in 1914, America suspended the gold standard. President Nixon closed the gold window. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed value. The dollar became a pure fiat currency. Its value was now based entirely on trust in the U.S. government. This is America's 1914 moment. And just like Britain, America was able to keep the reserve currency for a while through inertia. The world was trapped in the dollar system. There was no alternative. Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil only in dollars in exchange for U.S. military protection. This created the petrodollar system, forcing every country that needed oil to hold dollars. But America, just like Britain, made the fatal mistake. Faced with enormous debts and unable to cut spending or raise taxes enough, America started printing money. Massive amounts of money. From 2008 to 2020, the Federal Reserve created $7 trillion out of thin air through quantitative easing. Then during COVID, another $5 trillion. From 2008 to 2024, the U.S. money supply increased by over 600%. But America's production of goods did not increase 600%. The result is inflation. The dollar is losing purchasing power every single year. And just like Britain in the 1950s, foreign governments holding dollars are beginning to notice. China holds $770 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. They're watching the dollar lose value every year through inflation. They are asking the same question Britain's creditors asked in 1950. Why are we holding a currency that is being systematically debased? And they are beginning to act. China has reduced Treasury holdings by $530 billion from the peak. Japan has reduced holdings by $220 billion. Saudi Arabia is negotiating to sell oil in yuan instead of dollars. Russia, Iran, Brazil, India, South Africa, the BRICS nations are creating alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar entirely. The world is slowly, then suddenly, beginning to move out of dollars. History is not a collection of random events. It's a pattern that repeats with mathematical precision. And when it comes to reserve currencies, the pattern is as predictable as clockwork. Sir John Glubb's research on the fate of empires shows they last an average of 250 years. But reserve currencies last even less. The British pound lasted 120 years as reserve currency, from 1815 to 1944. The Dutch guilder before that lasted 80 years. The Spanish peso before that lasted 110 years. The French franc during the Napoleonic era lasted 25 years. The average lifespan of a reserve currency is 94 years. The US dollar became the reserve currency in 1944. 2024 marks 80 years. We are now in the historically dangerous zone, where every previous reserve currency has collapsed. But it's not just about time. It's about the specific mechanisms that destroy reserve currencies. And these mechanisms follow the same sequence every single time. Stage 1. Military overspending leads to unsustainable debt. Check. America spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, maintaining 800 military bases in 80 countries worldwide. The national debt is $34 trillion and growing. Stage 2. The government suspends convertibility to real money. Check. Nixon ended dollar-to-gold convertibility in 1971, 54 years ago. Stage 3. Money printing begins to finance deficits that cannot be funded through taxation alone. Check. The Federal Reserve has created over $12 trillion since 2008. Stage 4. Foreign creditors begin to question the currency's value and reduce their holdings. Check. China and Japan are dumping treasury bonds at record rates. Stage 5. Alternative systems emerge to bypass the dominant currency. Check. The BRICS nations are building payment systems independent of the US dollar. Stage 6. A crisis event reveals the currency's underlying weakness. This is where we are now, 2027. But there's one more piece of the pattern that makes the timing mathematically inevitable. The acceleration principle. When Britain lost the reserve currency, the fall wasn't gradual. It was exponential. From 1956 to 1967, just 11 years, the pound was devalued by 14% overnight. By 1971, devalued again. By 1992, the pound crashed so hard during Black Wednesday that Britain was ejected from the European monetary system. The pound went from controlling 60% of global reserves in 1945 to controlling less than 5% by 2000. The fall took 11 years to begin and 50 years to complete. But the breaking point was 1956, when the world realized Britain no longer had the financial strength to maintain the pound as the global currency. Now we arrive at 2027, Why 2027 specifically? Because 2027 is 16 years after the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, which was America's first major credibility crack, when Standard & Poor's downgraded U.S. government debt for the first time in history. More importantly, 2027 is the year when several critical tipping points converge simultaneously, creating what I call the perfect storm of reserve currency collapse. First, $7.6 trillion in U.S. Treasury debt matures in 2027 and must be refinanced at much higher interest rates. When this debt was originally issued, rates were near zero. Now, they must be refinanced at 4 to 5%. The interest expense on the national debt will exceed $1.5 trillion annually, consuming 30% of all federal tax revenue just to service existing debt. Second, Social Security's trust fund will be in crisis. The trustees' report shows the fund will be depleted by 2027, requiring either massive benefit cuts or enormous tax increases. Medicare will be approaching insolvency simultaneously. Third, and most critically, 2027 is the year when the global oil market is projected to see more than 30% of transactions occur in non-dollar currencies. This is the mathematical threshold. Once more than 30% of global oil trades bypass the dollar, the network effect breaks. The dollar loses critical mass as the international medium of exchange. Right now, in 2025, we can see the pieces moving into position, like chess pieces on a board. China has reduced treasury holdings by $530 billion from the peak. Japan has reduced holdings by $220 billion. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system, is negotiating to sell oil in Chinese yuan. The United Arab Emirates is accepting rupees for oil sales to India. Russia and Iran have been completely cut off from the SWIFT international payment system, forcing them to develop alternatives. The BRICS nations, representing 40% of global population and 35% of global GDP, are creating new payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. Brazil and Argentina are discussing a common currency. India and Russia are settling trade in rubles and rupees. Even America's closest allies are hedging their bets. The European Central Bank is increasing its gold reserves. Japan is allowing the yen to weaken against gold. Switzerland never stopped accumulating gold. They see what's coming. The smart money always moves first, and the smart money is moving out of dollars and into hard assets. Amazon is building massive infrastructure in Asia. Google is establishing data centers in countries with stable currencies. Apple is manufacturing in India to reduce dependence on China and dollar-denominated trade. Microsoft is investing heavily in European and Asian operations. These companies aren't doing this for patriotic reasons. They're doing it because their financial advisors see the same patterns we're discussing. They understand that when the dollar loses reserve status, American companies operating globally will face massive currency risks. They're positioning now, before the crisis hits. The specific trigger for 2027 doesn't matter. Perhaps it's a failed treasury auction when foreign buyers refuse to purchase enough bonds to fund the deficit. Perhaps it's a spike in interest rates that crashes the stock market and freezes the banking system. Perhaps it's a major oil producer announcing they will no longer accept dollars for payment. What matters is that the system is already broken. The trigger just reveals it to everyone at once. The mechanism that killed the British pound is the exact mechanism killing the dollar right now. Same playbook, different century. Just like Britain from 1956 to 1992, once the break happens, the decline accelerates exponentially. It will not be a single-day collapse. It will be a cascading loss of confidence over 10 to 20 years as countries systematically reduce their dollar holdings. The dollar share of global reserves will fall from 58% today to 40% by 2030, then to 25% by 2035. Each milestone will trigger further selling as central banks rush to diversify before the value falls further. This creates a feedback loop that becomes impossible to stop. American living standards will fall dramatically as import prices spike. Everything from electronics to clothing to energy will become more expensive for ordinary Americans. The federal government will face impossible choices: raise interest rates to defend the dollar and crash the domestic economy, or keep printing money and accelerate inflation. Either path leads to a significantly lower standard of living for the American people. The transition will be painful and permanent. When Britain lost reserve currency status, the British people didn't disappear. Britain still exists as a country, but the standard of living fell dramatically. The global influence vanished overnight. The ability to borrow at cheap rates disappeared. Britain went from being the center of the financial world to being a mid-tier economy dependent on others for critical resources. The British pound, which had been the global currency for over a century, became just another regional currency that nobody outside Britain wanted to hold. British banks, which had financed global trade for generations, became provincial institutions. The City of London, once the financial capital of the world, was replaced by New York, and later by a network of Asian financial centers. That is America's future. Not extinction, but decline, from superpower to normal country. A decline that has already begun, but most Americans cannot see yet because reserve currency inertia creates a lag between cause and effect. The system appears fine until the moment it breaks, and the break comes fast. The warning signs are flashing red everywhere you look. History is screaming across the decades, with the voice of every empire that thought it was different, every currency that thought it was permanent. The mistake has already been made. The money has already been printed. The debts can never be repaid in real terms without destroying the currency. The pattern is complete. The cycle is in motion. The mathematics of reserve currency collapse is as precise as physics. 2027 isn't just another year. It's the mathematical endpoint of decisions made decades ago, the inevitable result of a system that was always designed to fail. If this video opened your eyes to the mathematical certainty of 2027, if you can now see the same pattern that destroyed the British Empire operating in real time in America today, then subscribe to Economic Rewind, because this is just the beginning of the story. Next week, I'll show you exactly which assets survive currency transitions and how the ultra-wealthy have been quietly positioning themselves for this collapse for decades. The patterns are all connected. The reserve currency trap has been sprung. The clock is ticking toward 2027. And once you start seeing these patterns, you can't unsee them. This is Economic Rewind, where we uncover the financial patterns that shaped history and are shaping your future right now in 2025. Hit subscribe because the system operates whether you understand it or not, but understanding it changes everything. You cannot stop the cycle of reserve currency collapse. It is bigger than any individual, bigger than any government, bigger than any nation. But you can learn from Britain's experience. You can refuse to be like that British banker in 1945 who believed the system was permanent. The receipts are public record. The pattern is undeniable. This isn't coincidence. This is design. 2027 is coming whether you're ready or not. The only question is what you're going to do to prepare for the transition from the American century to whatever comes next.